Democracy in Conversation. And welcome back to Democracy in Conversation. And today we have a very special guest from Montreal. We have Odette McCarthy, who is the Executive Director of Equitas, the International Center for Human Rights Education. So Odette, thank you for being here. And I know that you do a lot of work on human rights. And as you were saying to me earlier, you do a lot of work where you're amplifying other people's voices and the voices of maybe people who otherwise wouldn't be heard. But today it's your turn. And just tell us a little bit about growing up. Did you always know that you wanted to work in human rights and democracy, or was this something that you just stumbled upon?
Thank you. Looking forward to our conversation today. I grew up in Saskatchewan, born and raised in Saskatchewan. Lebanese
Prairie girl.
Yes, I'm prairie girl. Lebanese mother, a father, descendant of Anglo-Saxon immigrants, and was always naturally interested and engaged in bridging, just from my own background. Folks in my own family faced incredible discrimination because of their sexual orientation, and sort of very young age in the 80s, 70s, 80s, was confronted to exclusion and marginalization. And then when I had the honor of going to Togo, West Africa in 1991 as a volunteer, interested and curious around education, in the middle of what was quite a moment for the Togolese and actually many countries in West Africa around very much democratic engagement with the sort of shifting of powers, and seeing, number one, being there and seeing the moment where people were really actively, for the first time in decades, voicing their opinions, and then actually seeing with the return of the leader in power at that point, a kind of a going backwards into fear and repression, and of young people literally disappearing that I had become close to. And so really beginning to understand the value of participation and also the risks involved. And that sent me on a whole trajectory.
And so, I've always thought that it's really important for young people, especially young Canadians, to get a sense of what things are like in the world. And that sort of experience you had in the 90s, that has then informed a lot of the work that you've done since then.
Exactly. I mean, I was very young. I was 21, and I came back and number one, realized how important it is for us in Canada, and where we had our own capacity to have influence and power in the choices we make in terms of what we consume, what we buy, how we educate each other and stay informed about what's happening around us. So that kind of public education became very much central to where I thought, okay, as Canadians, this is where we can have some impact. And continue to be very committed through study and through work to promoting and defending the rights of those that are often excluded and marginalized, in particular women. So that's been a real trajectory throughout all of my work throughout the years, and the support of women's organizations in Canada or internationally, who are really looking for ways in the context that they're in to be able to ensure that their voices are heard and they're included in the decisions that are being made that affect them.
And what does Equitas do? Like, what you said, human rights education, but what does that actually mean in terms of the kind of things that you do?
That's such a good question, and get asked often.
Yeah.
So kind of then pressing fast forward to my time in Equitas, and my strong, compelling wish to be part of what Equitas does was very much the idea around educating, but educating not necessarily in the formal sense of the word in the system, the education system itself, but actually having all of us. And if you think about Eleanor Roosevelt, who was such a big part of the actual Declaration for Human Rights, who talked about human rights being something that we need to be all talking about at our kitchen table. And that is very much what we do at Equitas here in Canada, but also, internationally, is ensuring folks know about human rights, understand their rights, their responsibilities, and the rights of others. And in doing so in their work, whether they're with their family, in their communities, making decisions that affect others, they're thinking about that and through that lens. And so at Equitas, we have a very participatory approach where we convene folks who are defending their rights, who are defending democracy, can be internationally, so through an international training program that we do, or folks here in Canada, young people who are, feeling excluded or feeling that there are others that are excluded, to understand the framework of human rights, but more importantly, to take the experience and expertise they have and share that learning. So we facilitate that mutual learning that happens among human rights defenders. And then they go back to their communities. And this is where it's really important. They go back to their communities with a renewed sense of knowledge and confidence, and are able to engage in different ways with decision makers or other community members. So just give an example, like for example, here in Canada, we're really, really concerned right now, Anita, with what's very divisive and polarizing, right? Mm-hmm. In terms of difference of opinions, be it political, be it based on people's orientation, be it based on people's religion, right? It's starting to really seep even into our schools. And so we were asked very clearly by folks that are leading young people, how can we help have those hard conversations? So we developed a whole approach that allows young people to come into the room with their strong opinions that they're getting from the outside, and that very sort of divisive way of looking at things and judgmental, to actually come in and to think about the people around the table as equals and to listen. And through that human rights approach, really think about, well, where is the commonality? And what we're seeing is young people then leaving those conversations, not necessarily agreeing, but having more respect for each other, understanding the power of being better informed and not being misinformed, and how they can actually influence, folks in their communities. So a way to start to kind of move away from that polarization that's out there.
You used a really important word. You said listen. And I think we're, especially with social media, we're at a phase in society where we're not hearing each other anymore. In fact, most people only see the people that they already agree with. And so it reinforces a lot of our biases. And, often, and as a politician, I've said this too, it is that face-to-face. And, I try to bring people together every Friday in a coffee hour, and I find it really incredible how when people start hearing each other's experiences, not some politician talking to them, but each other, and it makes them really rethink some of their own ways of seeing the world. So what you're doing is really that on a grand scale, and trying to have people hear each other.
Exactly. So for example, in our international training programs or regional training programs that happen in East Africa, West Africa, or happen internationally, bringing together folks from all over the world who are coming in because they have at heart some of the causes that they're defending and they're promoting in their countries that actually do vary from country to country. And then they come in, and through that whole process, they start to understand what they themselves can do to listen better to those that may be excluded. For example, women, how some folks are leaving understanding, that they should be making extra effort to be listening to the voices of women in their communities who can speak about, the marginalization that they're experiencing, or the exclusion they're experiencing, not necessarily always intentionally, and how that can be fully integrated into, efforts to be made to protect the human rights for all. And so the listening is really, really key, and the understanding and the not demonizing and not stepping into that space of really, pushing away that difference of opinion, trying to understand it, and then be, understanding of one's own barriers and biases that come into it. And that's so important in terms of democratic engagement. Yeah. Democracy is not simply just voting, right?
Exactly.
It's a very important part. We need to recognize
it is a very important part.
And then it's also all that happens in between in communities, and how they engage with decision makers and how they engage with each other. Yeah. And so that's very, very central to how we work at Equitas in Canada, and also how we work internationally, supporting the work that folks are doing in their communities.
So somewhere along the way, you must meet some pretty inspiring people. and some people that are really rising, have a lot of challenges and barriers, but are rising to that. Like, can you think of anyone in particular, or a few of them, that you wanted to tell about?
That's a really, really good question, and I would be remiss if I did not list off just a whole list of people that I've met that have been so inspiring because of their courage, because of their capacity to be resilient, because of the creativity in being able to, navigate really tough moments. And so I would say a shout out really to women that I have met in different countries, be it in countries in Northern Africa, Algeria, or in East Africa, for example, in Kenya, or in West Africa, and in Senegal, and Haiti. Incredible women who, in very, very, very complex political and social situations, have been able to ensure on a day-to-day basis that women are better protected against violence, that girls are educated, and they're able to make sure that the decision makers are mindful of that education role, are able to dialogue in an extremely healthy and important way with folks around them in their communities who are leaders, be it religious, be it political, who have authority, but in a way to really promote what is so essential in terms of having those equality, those rights being respected. It's been just kind of a constant admiration and inspiration, because there has been huge progress over decades. And I'm from a generation that has grown up in seeing that progress, sort of one legislative, one law after another that has developed in different countries and here in Canada to be protective of women's rights in particular. But also seeing the backlash and the threats of bringing back the needle, and the importance of actually maintaining that, and how so many women in so many corners of the world are continuing in a very creative way. So it wouldn't be just one, it would be sort of in many ways unconnected, but in very, very important ways connected. Women who are trying, to make sure that those gains remain and they can seek further.
And how do you stay optimistic? Because the work that you do, we used to think it was kind of a trajectory like this, and that it would just take X number of years to really reach full equality. And now we're starting to see that, in many places it is getting worse, especially for women. What makes you get up in the morning and keep doing this and keep bringing people together? How do you stay optimistic?
Well, I'm actually going to choose the word hope instead of optimism.
Okay.
I think that because that's really where I am able to anchor my own motivation, and also I am able to work with others. And why hope? Well, firstly, I think sitting here in Canada and in the position that I certainly am in, I feel I have a responsibility to continue to be hopeful. Because I continue to be impressed and so compelled by the resilience that I'm seeing. Iran, for example, which is just an atrocious situation right now in terms of the power and the courage of so many people under what is actually threatening their very lives. The incredible strength of so many in the civil society in Haiti, and what is literally crumbling before us. So we're very fortunate because we are living in a country that offers so much and provides so much, and we have that responsibility. I do think that's important. I think we have to be mindful of folks, here living in communities who in Canada who also aren't benefiting necessarily from the same access to resources and opportunities, and very mindful of that work that's happening internationally. So that is kind of one piece. And then the second is that, once again, as I've said it now several times, but it is so important to understand that despite all these threats, despite the shaking that's happening, even to the sort of international infrastructure itself right now, we're seeing a continued emergence of people who are continuing to think, to want to innovate, to be creative, in a constructive, positive way to continue the dialogue with the decision makers who they don't always necessarily agree with. And so for me, that gives me a huge sense of hope. There's a humanity. There's a real humanity. If you take a look at the Human Rights Declaration itself, 1948, many will say that it's dated. Many will say that it is no longer relevant. I completely disagree. If you look at it, the fundamentals of it are principles that actually date beyond before 1948. There were principled, documents and thinking that was emerging from Africa, that was emerging from the Persian region, and that declaration has anchored it and remains. If you think about the articles themselves, principles we can all get behind. No matter our religion, no matter our politics, no matter where we're sitting physically in the world, I would challenge folks to really, really not agree that that's what we're hoping for each other, without necessarily going out on sort of the few extremes out there that may not want that good for each other. There is actually this vast majority that do. And so for me, that's where the hope comes in. And then our ability basically to then kind of surmount the misinformation, the disinformation that's trying to sort of separate us all. I do not believe that is actually true, and that's fundamental.
I like how you just worded that. It's the good that we want for each other. And I really think when we talk about human rights, when we talk about democracy, freedom, what we're really talking about is wanting good for each other. And in many ways, just wanting for everybody to be able to participate. And you're from the side of things where you're doing a lot of education of perhaps people that are getting a lot of information that says that that when we talk about human rights or equality, I think it's sad that the word woke has become a bad word, but there's this very almost inexplicable backlash against what is essentially kindness and participation and people being able to have a say in how they are governed and how we are to each other. So in that, I imagine that in all the people that you've trained and connected, those seeds that you've planted, it's a ripple effect. You don't really know where those go and how they end up manifesting, maybe years later, long after, they've not been in your circle anymore. But do you know of some examples where you do?
I know many, and I as I said, I think I'll be to be respectful of people and regions. But if I think about, for example, in a country in West Africa, we've got sort of cultural norms. You have authorities who have huge influence, religious authorities as well. So we were really struck by finding that after trainings had been had at a regional level and communities around the importance of human rights and equality, that's important, the way we treat boys, the way we treat girls, and some of the religious leaders having participated, actually taking that on themselves and creating their own group where they could influence other religious leaders, so they understand actually it is really important to make sure that girls have can come to school and be free from violence and can have access to the same opportunities to educate themselves as the boys, and sort of to see how that wasn't necessarily planned or intended, and how that kind of spun out because there were one or two that were actually influenced and excited about what they were learning and wanted to share with others. And they're the ones speaking peer to peer that are able to do that. And so I have multiple examples of that. If I think about work in Canada, so we know that unfortunately there are people who experience racism here in Canada. And so one of the things that we've done is working with all kinds of anti-racist organizations in Canada, be it anti-Black, anti-Asian, Indigenous organizations, really working on the things that are important to them, bringing together and creating actually tools that they were able to, participate in creating, tools that would allow them to have the language to be able to really speak to folks that don't necessarily always want to talk about it, don't necessarily actually want to maybe even acknowledge that it's happening in their communities, and maybe are kind of pulled back a little bit by jargon or wording that is not helpful, but actually coming through with a human rights lens was an open door for them to be able to say, okay, now I understand, because once again, it comes back to the wanting that people have access to the same, resources and opportunities in their communities. And so kind of spinning away from, what is trying to pull us apart and that disinformation, and coming towards what we do have in common. And so many of the organizations that we work with have spoken about how those tools have really actually been helpful for them in their own communities here in Canada.
And what have you learned from them? I mean, I imagine, going into some of these sessions, meeting people completely different from yourself. I mean, what have you taken away in your journey from these people that you've met, the conversations you've had?
Wow, that's a really, really good question, because I'm certainly somebody who, on a basis, a day-to-day basis, actually continues to be very curious and actually really values learning and being challenged.
Mm-hmm.
That for me is actually really, really important in how we can show up, how we can continue to work with others in a way that serves and is contributing to an overall goal that we're trying to achieve. I spoke about it earlier. I talked about the inspiration. I talked about that admiration for the kind of resilience and creativity that I have the opportunity to see. That sometimes kind of comes out of very painful moments. On a very personal note, I'd say there's constant humbling. There's just we don't have the answers alone. We have to have answers together. And the power of actually, we've talked about it now, the importance of listening, the importance of understanding perspectives, the importance of what we're trying to achieve together, for the good of the communities that we're in, for the good of the of the people that we're living with side by side. So remaining very humble, understanding as well, that there's complexity around us, right? And there's it seems to be happening in a kind of more accelerated way, but in fact, there have been instances in our history as a humanity where folks have achieved, have overcome so much in adversity, and that continues to be very much the motor behind the kind of change that we need to continue. And so that's also continues to be something that I walk away from. And then somebody very very astute has talked about how we are quite lucky living here in Canada, but we actually need to understand that to continue to be able to live in a very healthy and a very robust sort of democracy, we need to be part of a larger community of democracies. We need to be mindful that existence has to happen elsewhere. And so I'm kind of continually reminded of that when I'm hearing from, reading, and listening to and exposed to what's coming out of many of the trainings that we do and the work that we lead. And then lastly, but I think it's really, really important to say is the personal, the very personal commitment that people make often when they come out to this kind of change that they need to be part of. So once again, kind of swinging back to the humility that, vibrant leaders that are facing all kinds of adversity in their communities are actually facing on a daily basis, and that still find a space to continue to learn, challenge themselves, and remain humble. So for me, that's just very, very powerful.
So the little girl from Saskatchewan who, as you were growing up, started to see the world around you was not always fair, to right now leading an incredible organization that does this amazing work around the world to make a more fair world.
Mm-hmm.
How would the little girl that you were view the things that you're doing now, and what would she say?
That's such a good question, Anita. Unfortunately, the world is still struggling. It's still really, really struggling, and the unfairness is still really, really present. So I know that the little girl would see that, and she would absolutely say, "This is a path. This is a good path." I don't. I don't know if she'd have the wisdom to know that there can't just be one path, but this is a good path to be on, to continue to be learning from others, and to be really putting all of what she would have to offer to contribute and to convene and to build on what others are doing, and that sense of doing it with others and not doing it on your own, because it can't be done on your own. And that sort of collective intelligence, but that collective leadership and that collective kind of solution, kind of resolution thinking, she'd be quite excited about that.
Well, you know what? Everything that you have just said, I think there are little girls out there and older people who really don't see that every single person has to participate in order to make democracy work. That all of us have it in us. And, you talked about the human rights, but listening, fairness, kindness, those are all things that we can all do. And I really appreciate that you came here to speak to others, a little bit about your work, a little bit about what you're doing, but really to have that conversation. And I think we need everybody to be having those conversations. So thank you for being with us, Odette. And this is Democracy in Conversation.